I've got two versions of it, two different fonts.
Oh, that's great.
This is a Mac and this is not. This is
Okay. As long as that's okay. So yeah.
That's fine.
You'll just be confused every time you look there. Great. So hi everyone. Thanks to everyone that's come in person, and thanks to everyone that's joining us online as well. So my name is Zaki, and yeah, again, thanks for joining us for this second seminar for Hillary Term 2025 with my co-convener Badruji. We're delighted to be joined by Professor Faridah Zaman today for a fascinating talk entitled The Twilight of Khilafat Thought. So as per usual, Professor Zaman will speak for between 40-50 minutes, however long you really like, and then we'll have plenty of time afterwards for questions, which will be directed by Badruji. So Professor Zaman is Associate Professor of the History of Britain and the World and Fellow and Tutor of Modern History at Somerville College, Oxford. She has two main areas of research interest. The first concerns Muslim political activists, religious scholars, journalists, and poets in early 20th century British India. And the second concerns the relationship between the British left, imperialism, and Islam in the 20th century. Professor Zaman has published on these topics in journals such as Modern Intellectual History, the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, and 20th Century British History. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Zaman. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for that kind introduction. So I'll just get started. It's a very bare bones presentation, but I felt like you should have something to rest your eyes on that wasn't me throughout the talk. So yeah, I'll get started. So the talk is sort of structured around 4 sections. And is that okay?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll start with kind of talking a little bit about kind of Indian pan-Islamism and the Khilafat movement, and then move into kind of thinking about the 1920s in a little bit more detail, thinking about the kind of abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate and what happens in the immediate period thereafter. Okay, so as many of you know, much of my work to date has focused on Muslim political thought in India, particularly pan-Islamic activism and writing. In my work, in general, I argue that the intellectual landscape of early 20th century Indian Muslim political thought was both expansive and capacious. I suggest that the dual imperatives of navigating life under British colonial rule in an increasingly globalized age and being part of a Muslim world grappling with persistent crises in the Ottoman Empire and Caliphate and elsewhere gave rise to novel conceptions of the relationship between India's Muslims and the broader world. Throughout much of the first quarter of the 20th century, it is clear that the Ottoman Caliphate itself served as a central locus of intellectual and political engagement, catalyzing experiments in pan-Islamic thought, particularly among those who I refer to in my research as the young Mohammedans, taking inspiration from a term used by colonial officials, no doubt pejoratively, to link these sort of upstart Muslims to contemporaneous movements such as those of the Young Turks. So I'm sort of trying to reclaim the term young Mohammedans, partly because I think it's quite a sort of useful way to gesture to the kind of novelty of their work. These dynamics reached their zenith during the Indian Khilafat movement, which is kind of roughly from 1919 to 1924, a period marked by the Caliphate's symbolic and political prominence in India. In my work, I've sought to argue in different ways for the seriousness of pan-Islamic thought in the 1910s and early 1920s, pushing back against what has been a tendency in the kind of dominant literature on the subject to treat Caliphate-centric activism in India as driven by personal interest and ambition among a number of key individuals who sought, it has been argued, to leverage the corporate body of global Islam towards greater political significance within India, wherein they represented a demographic minority. So pan-Islamism as a kind of effectively leveraging tool. I'm not particularly interested in whether this aspect may have formed some part of the calculation of leading pan-Islamic figures. I mean, it seems not improbable that it did. but rather with the opportunities and provocations that pan-Islamic mobilization offered to leading Muslim figures to formulate and articulate conceptions of the political in Islam, especially those that may have been original or distinct in some respect, even if often couched in the language of history and perpetuity. This was, in sum, an extended period of escalating crises that proved to be generative of new forms of Muslim political thinking, a period that has seemed, I think the first quarter of the 20th century has seemed a period pregnant with possibility in so many colonial contexts. And I'm trying to sort of argue that it's also true of Muslim politics in India in this period. Pan-Islamism inspired efforts among Indian Muslim leaders to imagine themselves in the world at large. Indeed, it's perhaps somewhat ironic that if Ottoman efforts to stoke pan-Islamism in the period of Abdul Hamid II and later, sort of in the early 20th century, was seen as a way to shore up the Ottoman Empire's strength relative to the encroaching powers of Europe, it was also the way in for Indians and other Muslim constituencies into the world of caliphal affairs. By taking an interventionist interest in the future of the Ottoman Caliphate, Indian pan-Islamists created increasingly sophisticated ways of imagining themselves coming to the rescue of the Caliphate, or it may be more accurate to say, of helping the Caliphate fulfill its responsibilities to the Islamic world. Thus, for instance, the various young Mohammedan schemes in the 1910s included a plan to set up refugee colonies in Anatolia for those fleeing the Balkan Wars, and the establishment of an organization for the defense of Islam's holiest sites, the semi-secret Anjumani Qudami Kaaba, which sought to recruit Indian volunteers to come to the literal defense of the Hijaz should it be encroached upon by foreign powers. After the First World War, when leading Indian Muslims were convinced that Ottoman defeat in the war would be used as a pretext by the Allies to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and effectively abolish the Caliphate by unmooring it from the temporal control of the Hijaz, pan-Islamism coalesced into what became known as the Khilafat movement. There is much that could be said and has been said about the Khilafat movement as a period that mobilized Muslims from across the ideological and sectarian spectrum. Notably, of course, this period of heightened activism brought Gandhi into the fold of Muslim politics, and it witnessed the hitching together of the Khilafat and non-cooperation movements in what was effectively the first sort of all-India political movement. One aspect that I found particularly compelling is the way in which Khilafat discourse in this period was inflected differently from different contexts. For instance, when a group of Indian Muslims was sent to Europe by the Central Khilafat Committee in 1920, led by the figure on the slide, Muhammad Ali, to advocate for the future of the Caliphate in the peace settlement, they produced a considerable amount of source material through meeting notes, letters, lectures, and pamphlets that represent, in some ways, the apogee of the intercessory mode of thinking about the Caliphate. The Indian representatives made strenuous and perhaps slightly tortuous efforts to argue that they were not here to defend the present Ottoman regime, but the very idea of the Caliphate, which was to them the symbol of the Republican ideal in Islam. They could not bear to see it devoid of temporal power, they argued, because that would represent its Vaticanization and leave the Hijaz defenseless. At various moments, in fact, they admitted that it was an accident, and an unfortunate accident at that the Caliphate had in recent years been attached to an autocratic sultanate. In a sense, much of this sort of Khilafat work produced little effect. A set of punitive peace terms were put before Ottoman representatives in the spring of 1920 and signed in August 1920 as what became known as the Treaty of Sèvres. But all this Khilafat work helped perhaps make Indian pan-Islamism appear less dependent or reliant on the future of the Ottoman Empire itself, intellectually at least. That said, it also reinforced the sense that Indian pan-Islamism was centrally focused on and indissolubly linked to the Ottoman Caliphate, a paradox for which there was no real solution. Indeed, the very fact that the Caliphate had played such a considerable role as a source of ideological and political stimulation to Indian Muslim thought made it particularly vulnerable not only to European interventionism from outside the Ottoman Empire, but even more seismically, it turns out, to the decisions of Turkish nationalists within the supplying port's own domains. This became readily apparent when the Turkish National Assembly, based in Ankara, decided in 1922 to depose the current Sultan Caliph, Mehmed VI, abolish the Ottoman Sultanate, and appoint a purely spiritual Caliph, Abdülmecid II, pictured on this slide. They justified this action on the basis that, to quote Ziya Gökalp, God's representative on earth is the people, not the Sultan. The news, of course, came as a shock in India, and many Khilafat leaders felt betrayed by the change wrought by Turkish nationalists. Some, however, were cautiously optimistic, believing that the republican nature of the caliphate could be reinvigorated by its separation from an autocratic imperial regime, and that the principle of election, for instance, might be reintroduced to caliphal succession. One such figure was the Shia jurist and historian Said Amir Ali. Amir Ali had done more than any other, I would argue, to give the Khilafat movement an ecumenical purchase before this point. Writing in the aftermath of the deposition of Mehmed VI, he wrote, somewhat counterintuitively, of the wisdom of the Turkish decision, for it rid the caliphate of its association with the inherently absolutist office of the Sultanate and would allow for the rules and regulations that sanctified the constitutional head of the Islamic Commonwealth to become important once again. Amir Ali hoped that the new Caliph, Abdülmecid II, would work with the people's representatives to promote the public weal and thus revive the memory of the early days of Islam. As the first Caliph to be elected by a parliament, Abdülmecid's taking on the caliphal mantle might indeed have been seen to boost the caliphate's legitimacy, which had often been brought into doubt. In June of 1923, another figure, Moshe Hussein Kidwai, who had played a critical role in providing Indian pan-Islamism with ideological coherence in the 1910s, was so confident that the caliphate was, quote, safe enough in the hands of the militant Turks that he thought Khilafat organizations in India should be disbanded altogether. A month later, there were distinct reasons for jubilation among Indian Muslims when it emerged that the punishing peace terms of the Treaty of Sèvres had been considerably revised in what became known as the Treaty of Lausanne, in no small part a product of Turkish nationalist success on the battlefield led by Mustafa Kemal. The revised treaty restored a significant degree of Turkish territory and appeared to have secured Turkish sovereignty. In a sense, this is exactly what the Khilafat movement had hoped to achieve, to secure the temporal foundations of the Turkish Caliphate against European predation. But while the new settlement was celebrated in India, there were reports of illuminations along the streets of Delhi. There was nervousness too, but the Caliphate did not appear to be an explicit part of the future imagined by Turkish nationalists, who under the new territorial settlement no longer held actually any jurisdiction over holy sites in the Hijaz. The peace terms had been revised, but it was not signed by representatives of the Sublime Porte, but by a government of Turkish nationalists who had deposed a caliph only a year earlier. And they were, of course, right to be fearful. The following year, in March 1924, news came of the deposition of Abdülmecid II and the abolition of the institution of the caliphate altogether. The Turkish National Assembly telegrammed the Central Khilafat Committee in Bombay to announce not only that, quote, the Khilafat has been deposed, but that, quote, the Khilafat office being essentially contained in the sense and meaning of the government and the Republic, the Khilafat office being essentially contained in the sense and meaning of the government, the Khilafat office is thus abolished. In fact, Khilafat means government, which means the state. The National Assembly ventured still further that, quote, the existence of a separate Khilafat office within the Turkish Republic proved to be disturbing to the foreign and internal political union of Turkey. The Khilafat office idea, which has been conserved since ages to realize the basis of a united Muslim government in the world, has never been realized, and on the contrary, has been a constant source of strife and duplicity among Muslims. They claimed the real interests of Islam would be served by the constitution of Muslims into independent governments. So reference to the disturbance of the foreign and internal political union of Turkey was a telling remark. It has generally been agreed that this was a reference to the Indian Khilafat movement itself, and more broadly, and more specifically, a letter co-authored by Said Amir Ali and another Shia leader, Aga Khan III, to the Turkish Prime Minister Ismet Pasha in 1923, which contained admonishments and veiled threats regarding the future of the caliphate. This followed a pattern of such Indian interventions. In 1920, for instance, before the signing of the Sevres Treaty, the Khilafat leader Muhammad Ali, who is pictured on the previous slide, had written a lengthy letter to the Caliph warning him not to sign the peace terms and to do his duty by Islam. If he would not, he warned, others such as the young Afghan Amir were waiting in the wings to prove themselves true mujahdids or renewers of Islam. Such interventions appear in hindsight to have been the product of a gross miscalculation of how much Indian Muslims could influence Ottoman or Turkish decision-making. But it's also true that in the aftermath of the First World War, Turkish nationalists had actively sought to encourage pan-Islamic interest in Turkey's fate. As Cemalettin suggests, the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923 may not have been possible without the collective efforts of the Muslim world and Indian Muslims in particular. By 1924, however, when the nationalists had effectively secured Turkish sovereignty, continued Indian interest in the caliphate was deemed a challenge to the stability and legitimacy of a republican nation-state. While the abolition in 1924 seemed a fait accompli, the Central Khilafat Committee in Bombay and the Jamiat Ulama-e-Hind, a recently formed political association of Indian ulama, jointly cabled a response to the Turkish National Assembly, expressing confusion over whether the office of the caliphate had been simply absorbed into the presidency or whether the executive of the Turkish Republic was entirely unwilling to accept any responsibility for the caliphate. They expressed their, quote, deep distress over the latter possibility. Indian Muslims, they said, had expected Mustafa Kemal, after achieving such successes as the Lausanne Treaty, to, quote, revive Islam's fundamental institution, purging it of excrescences as were not required by the Sharia in order to re-establish it on the form of a democratic basis. We believe, they wrote, that the Khilafat and the Republic are not incompatible with each other, and the continuation of the Khilafat after its reform will not only not be detrimental to the internal unity of Turkey, but will also be a source of strength to the Turkish nation in its relations abroad. They pleaded with the National Assembly to consider the advantages of a caliphate established on, quote, true democratic foundations. They rehearsed what was now a familiar argument in Indian Khilafat discourse, that they did not believe any particular family or nation ought to have a monopoly on the caliphate, but they continued to believe that Turkey was the last great Muslim power and was best fit to retain the institution. To abolish it now would be to cause diversion and dissipation of energy in the Muslim world, they argued, and would, quote, open the door to hosts of undeserving claimants. Sayyid Amir Ali, who had always maintained that the Khilafat movement was about the revitalization of the Ottoman Empire and through it, the revitalization of the Muslim world, was likewise bereft. Quote, he, the Caliph, is a symbol of Islamic unity. If he were to disappear, the Sunni congregation would fall to pieces. There is some irony, perhaps, that it was Turkish republicanism that ultimately threatened to undo the promise of Islamic republicanism. So in May of 1924, the All-India Khilafat Conference decided to send a delegation directly to Ankara to seek clarity and to remove such misunderstandings as may have interfered with the settlement of the Khilafat question. The government of India, however, denied the delegation's members passports for travel, indicating that as far as the government of India was concerned, Turkey's decision had effectively closed the caliphate question once and for all. Ramsay MacDonald's minority Labour government in Britain of 1924 adopted a position of, quote, complete disinterestedness. I only mention this because Ramsay MacDonald had expressed strong sympathies with the cause of the caliphate in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, when he was still part of a rather radical anti-imperial section of the Labour Party that envisaged some role for the British Empire in the revitalization of the Islamic world. The party, however, was in general keen not to get its fingers burnt on this issue in these years, and when the Labour Party came to power in 1924 for the very first time, MacDonald himself appeared to want to remain kind of above the fray. While Indian consternation continued and there were further attempts to intercede in the fate of the caliphate, there were also more prosaic assessments about the meaning of the decision. For instance, Abul Kalam Azad, another leading figure in the Indian Khilafat movement, wrote a series of articles in the Lahore newspaper Zamindar in the spring of 1924 titled The Khilafat Problem in the Turkish Republic, in which he argued that Mustafa Kemal's actions merely rectified the unsatisfactory division of spiritual and temporal powers that had existed since 1922. Muhammad Barkatullah, who some of you will know about, produced one of the most extensive analyses of the genesis, meaning, and implications of the Turkish decision, published in 1924 under the title The Khilafat. Like the aforementioned Moshe Hussein Kidwai, Amir Ali, and Abu Kalamazad, Barkatullah was in many ways a singular figure. Originally hailing from the Indian princely state of Bhopal, he was known to contemporaries as a scholar of Islamic religion, history, and literature. He had spent over a decade in England, 6 years in the United States, during which time he had been involved in the revolutionary anti-colonial Ghadar movement, and a considerable number of years in Central Asia and in Japan. In the foreword to the text, The Khilafat, in 1924, his undertaking was described as a combination of the historic, political, and religious aspects of the Caliphate question, with his own experience of present-day Muslim nations. His driving ambition was to see Islam restored to its sole basis as a social, practical, and democratic religion. Barkatullah's The Khilafat has been often mentioned, especially in kind of surveys of his career in particular, but rarely kind of extensively engaged with in scholarship. In many ways, it's not a wholly exceptional text. As I've already alluded to a moment ago, the idea that the Ottoman Caliphate had betrayed the true meaning of the Caliphate as an institution in Islam was a minor, but in fact quite frequent refrain amongst Indian Muslims from at least the early 1910s. But the fact that this critique was made during the decade that witnessed the most fervent pan-Islamic activism has rendered, I think, this persistent line of critique somewhat invisible. As I've noted, even the Indian Khilafat delegation, which spent several months in Europe in 1920 with the sole purpose of advocating for the defeated Ottoman Empire, acknowledged in meetings, speeches, writings, etc., that the institution had been tarnished in recent centuries by its association with an absolutist monarchy. Barkatullah's work is nevertheless interesting because he was writing in a moment in which there was no longer any question of reforming the Ottoman Caliphate. To the extent that his endeavor was to imagine a wholly new future for the Caliphate in Islam, he was required to draw a line under the Ottoman period entirely. As such, his critique of the Ottoman Caliphate was more extensive and severe than any Indian Muslim writer before him had ever dared to venture. It was more severe even than the remarks famously rendered by the philosopher poet Muhammad Iqbal in 1930, when he declared that the abolition of the Caliphate was a true act of ijtihad. For Iqbal did not venture to diagnose the ills of the Ottoman Caliphate, he merely implied that it had outlived its purpose. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Barkatullah's The Khilafat, just because I think it's quite an interesting text that I argue sort of as a sort of culmination of ideas that had been kind of present in Khilafat thought more broadly. So Barkatullah's work opened with a moving description of the departure of the last caliph from Istanbul following the decision of the president of the Ankara Republic to abolish the institution of the caliphate on the 1st of March 1924. Was, Barkatullah asked, this decision actuated by righteous motives or simply promoted by the love of power and glory? He proceeded to sketch the history of the past century of the Ottoman Empire, starting with the decision of the European nations to, quote, egg Christian subjects into rebellion, thereby weakening the empire. He referred to the efforts of European nations to force a constitution on the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, under which she would govern the empire under European tutelage. But Ottoman patriots, such as Mithat Pasha, had their own visions of a constitution of their own design, through which they could end the perennial problem of internal rebellion and foreign interference. They created, these sort of Ottoman reformers, an imperial parliament in which all elements of the nation would be represented and promoted the education of all communities and the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. He referred to the then Sultan Abdulaziz as a despotic monarch who would not have his autocratic power limited in this way. Mithat Pasha and his colleagues were therefore forced to dethrone him and install another Sultan, Murad V, in 1876. Murad was unfortunately sickly, so he was dethroned, and then we have Abdulhamid II, who promised to defend the constitution and was thus promptly installed on the throne. But Barkatullah tells of the shock felt by European powers when the constitution promulgated by the Turks themselves was far more liberal than anything that they had envisioned. Barkatullah writes of this moment in the 1870s as a moment of triumph, when the Turks outshone the Europeans in their love of liberty. The situation, however, was not to last, for Abdul Hamid II, during the war with Russia in 1877, saw an opportunity to become autocratic and establish a reign of terror. These are Barkatullah's words, which stalked over the length and breadth of the empire with ruthless tyranny for the next 30 years with impunity. Abdul Hamid persecuted the leaders of the 1876 constitutional revolution and effectively extinguished the lights of progress, liberty, and reform. Barkatullah compared this with the extraordinary advances in sciences in the, quote, civilized world, and the great strides made by countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan in this period. Barkatullah asked next why such excesses could not have been merely constrained by Mustafa Kemal in the 1920s in order to limit the despotic power of the Sultan, as Muslims who revered the Caliph from afar had hoped. But he concluded that the Ottoman experience had been that such power could not be constrained. In a notable move, Barkatullah argued that the problem was not with individual personalities. It didn't matter if it was Abdul Hamid II or whoever, but that the very office of the Sultan Caliph, the sort of conjoined office, was at fault. Quote, the very existence of the spiritual and temporal authority in one person puts a premium upon despotism, tyranny, and abuse, either by the sovereign himself or by his ministers in virtue of that authority. In this sense, Barkatullah did not believe the question was one of good versus bad sultans or caliphs, but one of intrinsic weakness. He pointed out that during 1919 to 1922, when Istanbul was effectively under foreign occupation by the Allied powers, and the Sultan Caliph was a virtual prisoner, the latter still pursued intrigues and undermined the efforts of the Ankara government. There was a limit, he thought, to Mustafa Kemal's patience, and the Sultanate was thus abolished in 1922. Behind this decision was a, quote, incessant struggle between despotism and liberty for the past half century and the devastation of years of warfare. Despite his own background, he was kind of, as I say, kind of a leading Indian Khilafat leader. Barkatullah saw how Indian agitation for the caliphate added to Turkish suspicion of foreign interference. Implicit in Barkatullah's account was that the abolition of the Sultanate and the Caliphate could, and perhaps should, have happened much earlier. From this point on, Barkatullah's book covered more familiar ground. In chapter 2, for instance, he recounted the early history of Islam and established that it had been democratic and republican in its ideals. The Prophet had ruled for the good of humanity and the public weal, he argued, and Islam's message was to end despotism of any kind, and the autocracy of priests. Rulers, he said, were meant to be servants of the people. Chapter 3 outlined the spiritual nature of the caliphate, noting that its chief task was to hold the community together. He was clear that the early caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Ali, made no pretensions to infallibility, nor claimed the absolute obedience of their subjects. In his sketch of early Muslim life in Arabia, Barkatullah repeatedly stressed, quote, communistic and fraternal way of living. In this regard, Barkatullah is, I think, speaking to the socialistic impulses of the Ghadar movement, but also earlier Indian pan-Islamist texts such as Mushar Hussain Kidwai's Islam and Socialism, which I've written about elsewhere. And lastly, of course, Barkatullah stressed the importance of consultation. The constitution of the Islamic government was made upon the basis of constitution, he argued, and it was really basis of consultation, and consultation is the manifestation of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The rest of the text continued on two fronts, first detailing the early history of Islam in greater depth, and praising Mustafa Kemal and the Turkish National Assembly for having the courage to abolish the caliphate. And then secondly, he charted what this sort of new spiritual organization of Islam might entail in what was, I think, a kind of extraordinary amount of detail. Barkatullah's text is, as I've already mentioned, in a sense quite singular, and Barkatullah himself is a writer with a curious career. And of course, Barkatullah doesn't quite understand the complexities of this past century of Ottoman government, and is oversimplifying grossly the kind of tension between the forces of liberty and the forces of despotism in this empire. But this text was also, I'd argue, the culmination of a certain strain of Indian Muslim political thought. for the past decade or more, one that had been able to hold the Republican ideal of the caliphate and the reality of Ottoman despotism conceptually somewhat apart, even if in their rhetoric this was sometimes hard to disentangle. The abolition of the caliphate became counterintuitively the moment when the ideal, or the kind of Republican ideal of Islam, seemed most alive to Barakatullah. And while we can look back on that now as a kind of quixotic hope, it was the spirit in which, for instance, many Indian Muslims approached the various Muslim congresses of the interwar period that I will turn to in a moment. Suffice it to say, for now, that the period of the Khilafat movement and early 20th century Indian Pan-Islamism more broadly keep showing us, I think, the discursive potential of Islam in periods of crisis. So then I move on to a period that I call the interregnum, even though it's not really fitting because there's not really another kind of caliphate down the line. But it feels useful to describe it as such, just because there are many people who expect and think that a new caliphate will emerge after 1924. So Indian Muslim responses to the abolition of the caliphate suggest that while the Khilafat imaginary was implicitly gesturing towards a world without the Ottoman caliphate, this world had certainly arrived much sooner than its leading figures had expected. Without the Ottoman Empire and caliphate to rally around, it could no longer be assumed that India's Muslims would play a decisive role in the future of Islam. The Ottoman Empire and caliphate had provided the conditions in which their references to the corporate power and collective future of Islam made sense. And without it, arguably, it didn't. That does not mean that 1924 was the end of a kind of Khilafat mode of thinking, however. Erstwhile young Mohammedans or Khilafat leaders were keen to be part of emergent transnational debates about the potential revival of the Caliphate and other forms of Muslim associational life outside of Turkey. Through this work, they arguably helped augur a new phase of Muslim thought, a period that might better be thought of as a kind of Muslim internationalism, but one in which the idea of the caliphate still sort of remained a central part. Indeed, perhaps this shouldn't be as counterintuitive as it might seem at first glance, for if the caliphate had always been as much an idea as an institution, one underpinned by an expansive discursive community and not constrained to a single empire or political region, then it is perhaps unsurprising that that community should have, to quote Mona Hassan, actively imagined ways to retain and reconfigure the caliphate after 1924. It's also worth noting that the Khilafat movement had, in a sense, already been quite internationalist. As the delegation to Europe, I've already referred to a couple of times, illustrated, Indian arguments in defense of the caliphate were being made in the centers of international politics in the aftermath of the First World War. Khilafat representatives were moving between London, Paris, and Rome, calling for the revision of the Turkish peace terms, and in the process, articulating an Indian perspective on the past, present, and future of the caliphate. In that very act of intercession, I'd argue, these Indian representatives were bringing the caliphate into the international arena and concurrently placing themselves in a central role in the future of the Muslim world. It's worth noting that there are kind of representatives of the Ottoman Empire in Europe at this time, but they're not kind of given entry into the spaces in which they might argue for the future of the Ottoman Empire or Caliphate. In a sense, these sort of Indian figures have much more column inches and opportunities to meet with statesmen, etc., than the kind of representatives from the Ottoman Empire themselves. Thus, once it was clear that the Turkish abolition of the caliphate was an irrevocable break, the future of the caliphate became the subject of urgent discussion in India. In keeping with the spirit of earlier delegations, former Khilafat leaders insisted on a collective way forward. In July 1924, the Hashemite Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who had come to power following the British-backed Arab Revolt of 1916, tried and failed to have himself recognized as caliph by Muslim representatives gathered for the Pilgrimage Congress in Mecca. Though Britain, as noted earlier, decried any official interest in the future of the caliphate, Sharif Hussein's candidacy was regarded by many observers, including the Bolsheviks, as an attempt by Britain to shore up its position in Arabia and raise its stature within the Muslim world. Subsequently, when news of a potential Caliphate Congress in Cairo emerged, Muhammad Ali's older brother and fellow Khilafat leader, Shaukat Ali, wrote to the head of Al-Azhar Mosque and University, which appeared to be promoting a new Egyptian caliphate in the person of King Fuad I, to insist that, quote, the future of the caliphate should be left to be settled by a world Muslim conference, one in which Muslim representatives from around the world would play a part in proportion to their population. This latter claim was particularly significant given the numerical strength, of course, of the Indian Muslim community. The suggestion, readily apparent, is that India's Muslims should play a significant role in any decisions about the future of the caliphate by virtue of their sheer size. Two other leading Khilafat figures, M.A. Ansari and Hakim Ajmal Khan, visited Cairo themselves to convey the importance of this point to the Egyptians in person. The eventual Cairo Caliphate Conference of 1926, beset by tensions and suspicions, was not, in fact, as broadly attended as had been hoped. The Indian Khilafat Committee declined its invitation to attend. I'm not entirely sure why. And tellingly, the Congress ultimately chose not to attempt to select a caliph on this occasion. But the idea that Muslims collectively could and should decide upon the future of the caliphate had, one might argue, nevertheless been established. Indeed, in the same year, a rival conference was held in Mecca under the auspices of Abdulaziz ibn Saud, who's pictured on this slide. Ibn Saud had invaded Mecca in 1924 and displaced Sharif Hussein, effectively establishing Saudi control over the Hijaz. The Mecca Congress of 1926 was notionally organized in order to discuss pilgrimage conditions, but was widely understood to be basically intended to normalize Ibn Saud's rule over the holy places and to advance a bid for caliphal authority. The Meccan Congress was, like the Cairo Congress 2 years earlier, earlier in the year, marked by dissension. Under Ibn Saud, Wahhabism, sort of puritanical form of Islam that the Saudi dynasty had adopted as its creed in the 18th century, experienced a revival. And amongst the chief tenets of Wahhabism was a strict understanding of the principle of Tawheed, or the oneness of God, that forbade the religious veneration of any entity besides God. That made Ibn Saud's management of the holy places, strewn with sites of pilgrimage, of course, not to mention his potential candidacy for the caliphate, deeply divisive, including in India. His most implacable critics forsook the Mecca Congress entirely. Muhammad and Shaukat Ali did attend as part of an Indian Khilafat delegation, but, quote, when they came to Mecca and saw what they saw, they carried out harsh and relentless assaults against the government of Ibn Saud and criticized his administration of religious policy, refusing to refer to him as king of the Hijaz. I'm quoting here from a report from a member of the Egyptian delegation. Upon their return to India, they kept up their invectives. So a speech delivered by Muhammad and Shaukat Ali and Sulaiman Nadvi in Karachi, which is quoted in the Times of India, they are said to have claimed the rule of Sultan Ibn Saud, though immensely better in preserving peace and protecting the highways of the Hijaz from robbers and bandits than that of his predecessors, is still far from satisfactory, and the Muslim world will not rest satisfied until a republic has been established in accordance with the wishes of the Muslim world. Quote. They had seen with their own eyes that the tombs of holy men had been desecrated, holy monuments left in disrepair, and the residence of the Holy Prophet itself had been rendered, quote, a heap of filth. Muhammad Ali declared that it was the responsibility of all Muslims to protect their holy places, by any means open to them, and noted that many of the leaders they had met in Mecca, including an anonymous Afghan general, had urged them to publicize the exact state of things to rouse the Muslim conscience. Shaukat Ali, for his part, contrasted their unsettling journey to Mecca to the comfort of returning home to his beloved and beautiful motherland, India, which they loved second to none. Muhammad and Shaukat Ali were surely angered by what they saw in Mecca in 1926, partly because it challenged much of the constituent elements of Khilafat thought and activity in the previous decade. I mean by this that in the period of pan-Islamism from the kind of 1910s onwards, people like the Ali brothers had cultivated a Muslim political subjectivity driven by the vision of Islam in peril, which in turn allowed for the possibility of Indian Muslims coming to the defense of Islam. They had encountered they had encouraged a focus on the redemptive possibilities of the person of the Ottoman Caliph, but also a profound confidence in the ability of ordinary Muslims in India to interject in the temporal fate of Islam and set it on a kind of new course. They had seen holy sites, shrines, tombs, and sacred geographies more broadly as centers of Muslim collectivity. This was as true when they invoked the holy places in the Hijaz as when they referred during the heights of the Hijrat movement in 1920, which was a kind of movement to encourage Indian Muslims effectively to emigrate to Afghanistan in protest against British rule. They had referred during that movement to the graves of their ancestors in India as the sort of anchors that would ensure that at some point these departing Muslims would return. Ibn Saud troubled this form of politics entirely in rejecting the sanctity of sites associated with the Prophet and the Prophet's companions, allowing them to fall into dereliction. He rejected a form of Muslim belonging rooted in a shared historical temporality. The very spirit of young Mohammedanism, weaving the material and the affective, seemed to be unmoored by his actions. So that, insofar as that's a sort of a reading of Khilafat politics, that seems to kind of it seems to then make sense why they reacted so harshly against Ibn Saud. The trouble with this interpretation is that if Wahhabism was indeed counter to the spirit of Indian Pan-Islamism, then this was not something that the brothers were themselves very quick to realize. Indeed, the brothers would speak so vehemently against Ibn Saud's actions late in 1926 would have been difficult to foretell just 2 years earlier when Ibn Saud's forces first advanced on Taif and then Mecca in September 24. In Taif, the Wahhabis were reported to have burnt houses, destroyed tombs, and also killed members of the ulama, old men, women, and children. So this was sort of quite widely reported in the Indian press. The implications should the Wahhabis take Mecca were clear. The Times also reported it's not likely that Mecca would escape without desecration if they were to capture it now. And events, of course, kind of bear this out. Explaining the distinction between Hussein and Ibn Saud as sort of competing forces in the region, the Times described the choice effectively as between orthodoxy and heresy. And what they basically say, which I think is sort of makes eminent sense, is that Sharif Hussein was sort of universally unpopular amongst Indian Muslims because he's seen as a kind of stooge of the Allies. But from the ordinary point of view, the Wahhabis must simply be seen as heretical. And if they were to occupy Mecca, the change would be from an unpopular ruler of sound religious views to a masterful man whose religious opinions would be a perpetual source of annoyance to the Malvis. Despite the seemingly clear contrast between the orthodox and the heretical, there was a lot of kind of suspicion, I suppose, in 1924 that the Khilafatists would effectively back Ibn Saud regardless. The Times, again, I quote here, argued that were Ibn Saud able to maintain his position, Muhammad Ali would surely wish to be the first to offer a bouquet, and the Khilafatists would follow, though it cast doubt on whether they ought to be able and they should be speaking for the 70 million Indian Muslims. Its advice to the latter was to beware of friends who were springing up in all these foreign countries and weed the garden of home politics with the hoe of rational self-interest. That Ibn Saud would cite the Khilafat movement as an inspiration. So there was a kind of period in which I think Ibn Saud was trying to sort of court Indian support. That he would cite the Khilafat movement as an inspiration indicated the extent to which the apparently Ottoman centricism of the Khilafat movement was subject to being hijacked for other ends. In supporting the Khilafatists, Ibn Saud's rise also made the prior period of the Khilafat movement appear all the more, quote, fanatical. The press claimed that in perpetually citing scripture, the Khilafatists had earned a reputation for themselves as fanatics, themselves desirous of theocratic rule. By early October 1924, it was reported that Muhammad Ali and the Jamiat al-Ulama-e-Hind had decided to back Ibn Saud. And there's some kind of speculation in the press that this is basically because they want to back a winner. They know Ibn Saud is pretty much firmly installed in Mecca. And even though he may be regarded as a bigot and a heretic, you know, he's the person who's now in charge. Alluding to the transnational activism of the Khilafat years, various Bombay-based papers wrote that all the old Khilafatist machinery has already been set in motion, so in support of Ibn Saud. Passports are to be applied for, deputations are to be sent, and the grievance which has disappeared in Turkey is to be rediscovered in a new form in Arabia. It only hoped that Britain, so this is kind of quoting the Times, it hoped that Britain, as the largest Mohammedan power in the world, saw fit to remain uninvolved, to avoid rousing an anti-British kind of clique of Muslims in India. So later in 1924, this is when kind of plans for kind of conferences in the Hijaz start moving, coming together. And at that stage, it was argued that the conference idea was actually kind of co-generated by the Central Khilafat Committee, which I'm not entirely sure about, but there is a kind of speculation that basically the Khilafatists are already working with Ibn Saud to produce a kind of conference in which they could legitimize his control over the Hijaz. What happens in effect is that when the Mecca Congress happens, the invitations really only go to kind of Indian princes, and the Khilafat Committee isn't invited. When asked about this, Muhammad Ali noted that although Muslim Indian princes felt the inviolability of the sanctuaries of Islam and the need to strengthen the temporal power of Islam as keenly as any other Muslims, they were also free agents who are in no way representative. But it's telling, I think, that only these Indian princes were effectively invited or allowed to travel, and the Indian Khilafat leaders were effectively kind of prevented from traveling. The idea of a genuinely representative conference, however, did not go away, and news emerging from the Hijaz of further destruction kept the matter urgent. So the following year, in 1925, a year after Ibn Saud's incursion into Mecca, news arrived in India of the reported bombardment of Medina and the desecration of the tomb of the Prophet's tomb, dome of the Prophet's tomb. Abul Kalam Azad, then president of the Central Khilafat Committee, and Shaukat Ali called a meeting of the Central Khilafat Committee to discuss whether they should send a mission immediately to the Hijaz in order to consult Ibn Saud about the future of the Hijaz and impress upon him the necessity of calling the proposed Islamic conference at the earliest opportunity. So this is before the Mecca Congress has happened. The mission would stay longer, if necessary, to inquire into the alleged attack on the Prophet's tomb and other Wahhabi desecrations. Zamindar editor Zafar Ali Khan would join this mission, and the Punjab government, in fact, gave him permission to proceed to Mecca to see things for himself and place the correct news before Indian Muslims. And there is lots in the press from this period, actually, that's quite interesting about the various acts or outbursts of mourning that happen in various places, including in Bombay regarding the sort of desecrations. And there are kind of actually strikes or hartals that are held in this period where people basically shut up their shops. All sects seem to be involved in this, basically in protest at what's happening in Mecca. In effect, the news, I suppose the evidence that we have is that ordinary Muslims in India, however that might be defined, had already kind of determined that Ibn Saud was sort of unconscionable. Still the Ali brothers were not yet implacably hostile to Ibn Saud. So the kind of the strength with which they condemned him from 1926 is still kind of not in evidence yet in 1925. What's interesting about this is that their spiritual mentor is a figure called Abdul Bari, who's a kind of leading figure of the Firangi Mahal seminary. And he comes out very strongly against Ibn Saud and the Wahhabis very early on. So I'm drawing a little bit here on the work of John Willis, who's written about this. And he notes that, Abdul Bari was very troubled by the fact that Ibn Saud was sort of effectively killing civilians, including members of the ulama, destroying holy sites, but also effectively straining the basis of an already tenuous Muslim unity in India. Whereas other Khilafat leaders could see a way forward with Ibn Saud still in control of the holy places, but perhaps restrained in some way. Abdul Bari departed from the Khilafat fold entirely, forming a rival organization that was avowedly opposed to Saudi sovereignty over Mecca. John Willis notes that, along with other scholars from Farangi Mahal, Abdul Bari took to the pages of the school's newspaper and its press to publish attacks on the Saudis and to print legal and religious tracts in defense of the practices of veneration associated with the tombs of Mecca and Medina. Abdul Bari himself published a legal treatise with the Farangi Mahal press that unequivocally defended the visitation of tombs on the basis of revelation, the traditions of the Prophet, and a normative reading of Hanafi law, arguing not only that it was permissible, but in fact recommended. In so doing, Abdul Bari signaled that Farangi Mahal was diametrically opposed to the Saudi regime. As with the Hijra movement in 1920, so that movement of mass immigration, this was an instance when leading Indian divines diverged on the virtues of Indian diverged on a kind of seemingly kind of theological question, but it revealed a deeply fractured understanding, I would argue, of kind of space in Islam and kind of territory in Islam, where the Saudis refused to countenance the sacralization of physical sites and space, believing that it contravened an essential injunction in Islam. For Abdul Bari, the topography of Islam demanded veneration. Unsurprisingly, in this instance, in sort of 1925, Muhammad and Shaukat Ali appeared to have fallen out with Abdul Bari. And then fatefully, Abdul Bari died the following year in 1926 before the three could be reconciled. A fact that is said to have weighed on the brothers' consciences going forward. And this may indeed have contributed to their seemingly quite dramatic change of heart by 1926, when after their trip to Mecca they basically argued, as I kind of quoted earlier, you know, the Muslim world will not rest satisfied until a republic has been established in accordance with the wishes of the Muslim world. So they, in a sense, I guess, flip-flop on the issue of Ibn Saud. More vocally and consistently opposed to Abdul Bari was Abul Kalam Azad. Azad condemned the veneration of tombs, which he argued had no basis in the Quran, prophetic tradition, or Islamic jurisprudence. In a pointed attack on Abdul Bari, he questioned the jurisprudential skill of anyone who could reach any other conclusion. Willis notes that Azad wrote at length in his period on the need for peoples to transcend nationalism, and yet and he kind of imagined Mecca as a sort of meeting point for sort of humanity, of a universal humanity. And yet in Azad's letters and articles on the subject of the Saudi desecration of tombs and shrines in 1925, he was clear that he would not oppose the kind of Saudi vision of Islamic scripture because it conformed with his own understanding of prophetic revelation. I won't kind of dwell on this too much, but it's just kind of worth noting that Azad, as a kind of leading Khilafat figure, effectively offers his support to the Saudi conquest of the holy places, which I think is kind of an interesting point in and of itself. It bears emphasizing this conclusion because it speaks to the broader salience of discourses of universalism in this period. The literature on Islamic universalism is broad and growing for those who work on it, and it has often been posited as the counterpart to a putatively hegemonic liberal universalism in this period. Though notionally accepting the right and even potential of all societies to achieve perfect freedom, liberal universalism placed constraints on the capacities, of course, of certain nations and certain peoples to enjoy such freedom. As a form of counter-universalism, Islamic universalism might be said to have negated the exclusion of the Muslim world from the liberal imperial order. And yet it's unclear that Islamic universalism, if that's what we want to kind of refer to kind of pan-Islamism as, had ever denied the continuing relevance of the Prophet or the normative model of the Prophet and the companions and the early caliphs, or that pan-Islamism had ever really stopped speaking of unity in dual registers which were not always easily reconcilable. That is to say, pan-Islamism suggested that the closer union of the Muslim world was a desirable political and religious goal. At the same time, it suggested that such unity would be instructive for the global, and I don't think that tension has ever really worked out. It was in fact never suggested that the union of the Muslim world was a step towards the progressive realization of a broader humanity of free and equal occasions. Those who posed a vision of human unity inspired by Islam referred to the destructive effects of national, racial, social, and political divisions in the present, and gestured to a world free from such conflict, but never really implied a future in which the Muslim Ummah would cease to exist as a distinct community bound by faith and scripture. In this sense, what had made the pan-Islamism of the young Mohammedans in the 1910s so distinctive was the frequent slippage between Islam, India, and the global. But even at the height of the Khilafat and non-cooperation movement, the discourse of unity was strained by the awkward translation of ethical concepts and categories across religious lines. In the aftermath of the abolition of the Caliphate, it was far less common to find the cause of Muslim unity identified as a universal cause, though it remained salient within the parameters of the Muslim world itself. I will move on to kind of conclusions now, or what I've called sort of new horizons. The apparent failures of the Cairo Mecca Congresses are failures in the sense of failing to elect a new caliph, and the bitter acrimony and divisions caused by Ibn Saud's accession among the young Mohammedans might be read in several ways. And I'll offer three ways by way of kind of conclusion. So first, one might argue that it was Ibn Saud's incursion into Mecca in 1924 and not the abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate and Caliphate in 1922 and 1924 respectively that represented the real end of the Khilafat period. Certainly the rise of a ruler in the Hijaz with so little concern for or need for the support of Indian Muslims left the latter adrift. But even more problematically, Ibn Saud's actions exposed the fundamental differences in theological understanding amongst leading members of the Khilafat movement. And of course, there had been earlier disagreements in emphasis and approach, but I don't think any unmade the basic understanding of the relationship between Muslims and the Hijaz and the way that the dissension produced by the Wahhabis did. Another second way of reading this moment might be to say that it counterintuitively affirmed the idea that the Muslim Ummah could and should collectively deliberate over the future of the Caliphate in the Hijaz. As I've said, subsequent congresses, whether in the 1920s or 30s, reinforced the principle of a spatially dispersed authority and the importance of consensus or ijma. We know that figures such as Shaukat Ali would play a leading role in the 1931 Muslim World Congress in Jerusalem. And the fact that no consensus was ever reached on the establishment of a new caliphate might also suggest that once this departure had taken place, it was difficult, if not impossible, to return to a model where so much spiritual and political authority was vested in a single personality. If the Khilafat movement was truly about realizing the Republican potentiality of the caliphate, you might argue the fact that there was never another kind of caliphate in the world thereafter is a sort of kind of fitting outcome. The final thing I might say is that it might be worth thinking about the effect of the abolition of the caliphate with reference to what else was happening in the wider world at this time. So in the months that immediately followed the abolition of the caliphate, the two newspapers that Muhammad Ali is really famous for setting up in the 1910s, Comrade and Hamdard, which have been really effective vehicles for his pan-Islamic politics, they re-emerged in the mid-1920s. And though the Comrade's second phase was very short, Muhammad Ali quickly established that the question of Muslim life in India was still bound up with the world beyond it. So this is kind of post-caliphate. For instance, the Comrade of November 1924 to January 1925, only the kind of 3 months that it's active, looked much the same as it had done before the First World War. But beneath the surface of appearances, there had been subtle shifts that were reflective of how much the world had transformed in the previous decade. Whereas in the early 1910s, it had been full of concern for events such as the Moroccan crisis of 1911, when France and Germany came to the brink of war over Morocco. The major global event during the Comrade's second phase was the Rif War, Morocco's guerrilla fight against Spanish colonialism. Rif leader Abdullah Karim, who's pictured on this slide, led a kind of Confederate Republic of the Rif, emerged as a heroic anti-colonial figure in the way that the Young Turks and even Mustafa Kemal could not have done. Though the controversy over who, if anyone, would take up the mantle of the Caliph raged on in the 20s and 30s, it's clear that the horizons of Muslim politics were expanding in other directions. In a sense, the disappearance of the Ottoman Caliphate might be said to have produced a pan-Islamic outlook that was even more capacious than it had been before.
Faridah Zaman for a very interesting presentation.